Sometimes we just want to try something new, but the amount of information can feel too overwhelming to decide where to even start. This essential guide might become your best friend in the coming month because it goes beyond obvious theory with an emphasis on what to expect and how to approach a unique medium like watercolor painting. So first, I'm going to give you a full picture of how watercolors work, bust a few myths about it. Then we'll take a basic supply store and we'll explore the foundations of watercolor painting in 5 short lessons with all the golden nuggets I think a beginner will need to want to keep practicing and most importantly, to make great progress. And to help you get your feet wet and pump you up for more, we'll end this video with a quick and easy landscape practice painting. So first, how do watercolors work? Water is what makes watercolors so one of a kind, so beautiful. It plays a major part in the painting. This is watercolor paint. No matter where you get it from, tubes, pans, I think the first thing to keep in mind as a beginner is that everything in watercolor revolves around water, to the point that it's very rare to use it pure or almost pure, only for last touches in the painting if the artist likes that effect. And you will quickly notice that you need to add a lot of water to the paint, especially when you start on a new painting. It's important because something that I see beginners do all the time in classes and workshops that I teach is to use watercolor with too little water, just like that. And it can end up looking opaque on paper, kind of like wash. It's not a bad thing at all, but when a beginner does it because they're not aware of how much water watercolor takes, they're missing out on what makes the medium so fun and magical. Something else worth pointing out, especially if you're one who's familiar with mediums like pastels, pencils, oils, is that with watercolor, you'll be surprised to see that you need to approach a painting as a whole rather than by sections. You can paint on sections when adding details towards the end of a painting, but first you'll need to think in terms of background, then middle ground, and then foreground, and train yourself to scrap all details from your mind in a way. So remember that with watercolor painting, you will have to learn to add water to your paints and to manage paint and water together in a piece of art. More on that later, and in the painting we'll practice together. And you will also get to learn how to tackle a painting in its entirety rather than in sections. Common cliches about watercolor is that it's very hard. And yes, it is when you get started, just like everything else. But when you start mastering water and understanding how it works with the paint, then it gets a lot easier. Another thing is I find that in people's minds, watercolor is often associated with loose works like furls and just spontaneous works. But in fact, you can really paint anything, even realistic works. You can even combine different styles, and that's what I love about watercolor. And the last one is that you can't fix mistakes with watercolor. And I can tell you that I've proved myself time and time again that you can in 98% of cases. And once again, as long as you master the basics really well, it's a lot easier to do that. With watercolor painting, you can get away with using very few supplies. And I actually fit all of mine in this bag when I go teach classes, minus the paper if I need a big sheet. Unlike normal papers, watercolor paper manufacturers add a binding agent that makes it possible for colors to flow on the surface and work their magic. That's why watercolor paper is a must-have supply to watercolor paint. It can get confusing for a beginner though, because watercolor paper is available in different formats. As a beginner who's not sure they're going to enjoy watercolors for months and years to come, I would get a small pad or even a few single sheets to try out different papers. And I would ask my local store if they have samples to give away. There are also many different brands of paper, and not all are equal. So my global advice there is to avoid very cheap or unknown brands and stick with the ones you would easily find at an art store. Watercolor papers are also made out of different fibers, and that will affect the way watercolors behave, more or less. The most common ones are cotton papers and cellulose, also known as wood pulp papers. I would start with cellulose paper because it's affordable and decent, but I'd avoid the cheaper kinds and go for mid to high range cellulose papers to be safe and keep the experience of watercolor enjoyable. And as soon as I feel that I love watercolors to the point that I want to experiment more, I would switch to 100% cotton papers if I can afford that, because they yield much better results and they're just a lot more agreeable to work with too. And if you can try that at least once to see for yourself, I think that's great. No matter what type you end up picking, I'd cut out small 5x7 or 6x8 inches sheets to make my blocks last longer and practice on a small and more reassuring scale that applies to what I want to create, of course. Something puzzling for a beginner is that even though 100% cotton papers always have that mention on the block or the pad that you buy, cellulose papers don't mention anything. There's nothing at all. So if you see nothing, then it's probably cellulose paper. If you do get a glued block, you might also appreciate knowing that you can paint straight on that block or get the sheet out first. And to actually detach a sheet, you'll need to find the slit that the manufacturer added for you and slide something sharp inside. I remember when I got started, that really got me confused. And the top protective sheet is also often black in blocks. So you might think you got the wrong color, but don't worry, it's completely normal. And the real sheets are underneath that cover. And on top of that, watercolor papers also come with more or less tooths. You know, those are the small hills and valleys that are on the surface of any paper. The one I recommend is cold press. I find it neither too smooth nor too grainy, and that kind of texture works well with all projects one might want to paint, even fine strokes like realistic hair. And it deals with water well too. Watercolor papers also come in different weights, and the one that I recommend and that I see is used often is 300 grams per square meter. It's a good compromise between the lighter weights that might warp more easily with water and the very thick papers that might not be convenient for your everyday painting. My favorite choice as a seasoned artist is this one. It's Arches watercolor paper, 100% cotton, 300 grams per square meter, and it's cold press. I started with a small Clairefontaine cellulose watercolor paper pad, and I remember it worked fine for me at first. I even know people who prefer cellulose papers over 100% cotton papers, so that's something you're gonna have to experiment with. Paintbrushes is another difficult choice of beginners because of the many options, and they come in different shapes. All this choice can be tempting, but as a beginner, I suggest to focus on 2 round brushes similar to these because they are the most versatile of all. You can use them for washes, for large strokes, and finer details. I started in 2019 with these 2 because they fit my small paintings very well, and you can see I was able to paint a variety of things with just these. I still use them to this day with every painting. I would completely avoid plastic water brushes like these, as I think it makes it hard to control how much water comes out of it. Paintbrushes sizes can be extremely confusing because first of all, there are many of them, and online it's very hard to tell how big or how small a paintbrush is. So my best advice to you would be to go to a store and buy the kind of paintbrush that would fit the paper you want to work on very well. And that's so painting feels convenient to you. For example, I would avoid using this tiny paintbrush on a very large sheet if I wanted to paint mountains, let's say, and I just keep it for the smallest details, if any. Then there is also the quality of the bristles, and the 2 main categories are the natural animal hair paintbrushes and the synthetic paintbrushes, and you'll find a blend of the 2 as well. I personally prefer natural hair paintbrushes because they hold water so much better and they glide gently on paper. Painting feels smoother with these. But I see others who prefer the synthetic kind, and usually those feel a bit more firm than the natural hair paintbrushes. So once again, nothing is set in stone, but you have my best recommendations here. As far as watercolor paints go, there are different types, and the most common ones are tubes and the half pans. Pans being obviously twice as big as half pans, but just not as common in sets and even in art store. The only notable difference between watercolor in tubes and watercolor in pans is that the kind in tubes comes right out of the manufacturer. Therefore, it shows more moisture than the kind in half pans that will always feel very dry and even a bit hard to activate when it's brand new. And don't be fooled, because a lot of artists, like me, like to pour their watercolor in tubes into half pans. The benefits of doing something like that is just it helps waste less of the paint because it's easier to take just what you need from a half pan. While with a tube, it's easy to squeeze too much paint out. Half pans also make it easier to build a certain color palette when you start having favorite colors and to have it all in one place without having to carry tubes. As a beginner, I would opt for half pans to start. I would go with a 12 to a 24 half pan set of paints. There are plenty on the market with all the basic colors you need. I think the 24 half pans ones might give you a bit more room to experiment without needing to worry about color mixing. And a funny thing I noticed as the months passed by in my practice is that not only did I use the same colors all the time, but I started using less and less colors. So when you hear you should use 3 to 5 colors, that will come with time. For now, do what makes you feel comfortable. But it's true that it's actually more convenient to use less colors because then you can focus on the painting better rather than juggling with a bunch of different colors. And it's also helpful for keeping a good color harmony in your painting. For quality, you'll find affordable student-grade paints as well as more expensive artist-grade paints, also known as professional paints. And just like paper and paintbrushes, I would stick to the principle of choosing a common brand that you'll find at any art store. I did have a negative experience once with a cheap set of paints that a brand sent me. The paints were okay, but they were a little bit chalky. They spread out well, but then it was hard to layer them on top of each other. And I noticed it was a huge set full of colors and pretty cheap, so I would stay away from these. How paints are made and their properties will vary depending on the brand. I think the most notable difference is colors are likely to be less durable over time with student-grade paints, when artist-grade paints often offer more reliability. That's why artists who sell their art will often opt for these. I personally haven't noticed a huge difference between both types, visually speaking. They do their job of spreading on paper and look vibrant and lovely in most cases. So I would totally encourage you to start with student-grade paints and upgrade towards artist-grade paints later if you want to. To make painting easier, 2 jars of clear water are helpful. 2 because one of them is to wet a paintbrush with clear water and the other one is to rinse a dirty paintbrush. The idea is to always have a clean jar of water at hand and the other one can get dirty. It's okay, but then know as a beginner that you'll get mixed up. Both of them will end up dirty very quick and that's okay. You just need to change the water in that case. Because the main problem with dirty water could be to alter one of the colors you want to use or just dirty the paper when you want to work on a wet surface. Paper towels or an old rag will be very helpful. I mainly use them to lay my paintbrushes on. They're also helpful with a bunch of watercolor techniques that I won't be covering today, but you will get to learn that while you practice. A mixing tray or palette is very handy unless one is already built in your set. I find a metal tray or ceramic palette are easier to clean than plastic, but all of them work. Now, these are the optional supplies you can expect will be helpful. Masking tape or scrapbooking washi tape also works. And this is awesome to tape a blank sheet of paper all around so you can start painting without having to worry about it moving around constantly. And it also gives paintings crisp edges that look really cool. Some people don't use masking tape, they'll just wet the whole sheet and it will stick to the surface they're working on, but that means working on wet right away. And I find that's hard for beginners, so I think masking tape is a great option when you get started. A pencil, ruler, and eraser are always going to be super helpful for light sketches. Anything basic you have works. One thing about watercolors that will put certain people off is that you have to wait for the painting to dry before you can keep working on it. I'm not patient, I guess, so I've been using a scrapbooking heat gun to dry my paintings. It allows me to keep working on them right away or to put them aside immediately when I'm done. A hairdryer also works. Just make sure when you use these to keep far enough from the sheet that it doesn't get damaged, or to also dry the whole sheet as evenly as you can rather than drying one portion of it, then another, etc., just so the water dries evenly. Otherwise, you'll get some drying stains. And we're going to do that together in the painting at the end of the video. Super useful is a scrapbooking cutting mat or something similar, anything sturdy, preferably waterproof and even heat-proof if you plan on using heat. It's really convenient to keep the table clean. Otherwise, a simple piece of cardboard will do, but you'll have to replace it often. With watercolor, know that you'll be painting on a flat surface because the water will run down the page otherwise. But to create certain effects, it's helpful to fix the sheet to something that you can actually move around when you need to. A white gel pen or white gouache aren't a must-have in the beginning. They're just awesome to add small, super crisp highlights. I've had them since the beginning and I really enjoy them, but I think it really depends on style. And you'll notice when you take tutorials that a lot of artists actually use them for small highlights. We're done with the supplies, and now I want to show you what adding water to your paints actually looks like. And I will be using dry paints from half pans to do that. Creating puddles of paint and water is the start of anything you're going to do with watercolors. That's why I think paint consistency is a key concept that beginners should learn. This is my paintbrush. I'm not peculiar about which one that I use to get my watercolors mixed with water. I just want something that's small enough to fit my pans. I dip it in clear water, then I go get some paint. The paint is dry at first, but since the brush is wet, it gets reactivated with a little back and forth. When I have some paint on the brush, I drop it in my mixing tray, and I repeat that until I get the amount of paint that I think I might need. You can create different consistencies of paint by just adding the amount of pigment you need from your half pan or the amount of water you need from the jar. For example, the more water you add to the paint, the lighter and the more transparent it gets. And keep in mind there that watercolors always dry a bit lighter than what they look like when they're wet. So unless you really wanted something to look very light, you're always going to want a watery but still colorful mix at minimum. Now add a bit more pigment to that puddle and it becomes a bit creamy now, like milk kind of. And you can see it looks less transparent and more vibrant. Let's keep adding pigment to the point now we're getting something that's more on the thick side, and you can see how much more vibrant and opaque that is looking. A tip I like to give my beginner students is to always mix the paints that they know they're going to need before they start on a painting, because that frees up your mind from having to do this step as you paint. And we'll practice that together in our painting later. Watercolor lasts way longer than we think it would looking at these tiny half pans, and that's because with all that added water, we're not using that much pigment at all. So try not to worry about wasting paint when you're learning. A fun exercise to practice mixing water to paint is to start with swatches. They're extremely helpful as they'll help you remember what each color really looks like on paper so you can pick more easily. Best practice is to make swatches on a piece of paper that is the same as what you'll paint on for color accuracy. And start with the first color in your set, follow the order. Make sure to rinse your paintbrush between each color so each one stays intact. We don't really care about the consistency of the paint at this point when we make swatches, we just want it to be the same across all colors. Later, you can even experiment with mixing colors together or create your first gradients of color and also research the properties for each color you have. And in the description of the video, I'll link an awesome playlist with all the stuff that you need to learn more about that. So you know how to create a puddle of paint, but to actually start a painting, you gotta know some techniques too. For a beginner, only 2 of them matter because they are pillars to watercolor painting. They can help any artist, beginner, intermediate, or advanced, to achieve countless beautiful watercolor projects without even needing anything else. All of the techniques are extra, you can learn them as you go, that's why I'm not going to include them here so we can keep this digestible. Do you remember paint consistencies? Well, I recommend to always start practicing or painting from a watery but pigmented puddle of paint so colors can move on paper, but at the same time they stay light enough to start so you can actually fix something if you made a mistake. The first main watercolor technique is called wet in wet. The paintbrush is wet since we dipped it in our mix of paint and water, and the paper is now wet with a clean paintbrush. Wet paintbrush in wet paper, wet in wet. Let's add another color nearby. And notice how the paint spreads out thanks to the added water on paper. Not only that, but both colors are able to flow and intermix and create another color together. This is why water is such a key aspect of watercolors. And with this technique, you can paint soft backgrounds. It could be beautiful skies, abstract pieces. Remember that as you practice this technique, you will notice that the more wet the paper is, the more the paint will spread. And the drier the paper gets if we wait, the less the paint will spread. And I have two very popular videos featuring my beginner niece and my beginner son who had no idea how to use watercolors. I compared their don'ts, all the mistakes they were making with the water and paint, and I showed the do's right next to it. So if you want to learn more about that, I think those will be helpful to watch, and I'll make sure to link them in the description. The second technique is called wet on dry. The paintbrush is wet since we dipped it in our mix of paint and water once more, but this time the paper stays dry. Wet paintbrush on dry paper. And notice how this time we're getting very sharp edges. And this is an easy technique because there's no rush here, no paper drying issues. This technique is great to add details or improve a part of the painting we want control over. And remember, the paint won't spread out as long as the paper is 100% dry. That's why you always need to make sure paper is dry when you use it, unless you want that effect of paint spreading a little bit. And now maybe you're wondering how to use these techniques and in what order to do it. In most paintings, no matter the artist's style or level of proficiency, remember we tend to approach the painting as a whole and move towards the details as we go. That's why usually we'll paint with light colors first, and as we progress, we'll start adding darker, more opaque colors because it's easier to add dark touches on light paints, and it also helps us correct mistakes when we start light. We can also shape a painting little by little more easily. Something worth mentioning about watercolors is that aside from portraits, it's very easy to paint a lot of different things with very little drawing knowledge. You'd be surprised of how little sketching you need to end up with an art piece that's full of colors and details. How you go about the techniques you want to use and the order you do it in is going to vary, of course, depending on the artist and their style. But I'm seeing two main approaches here that I'm going to share. The first one is you'll use the wet on dry technique, which means the paper is dry. Maybe add small touches while the paint is still wet, and later, maybe a few layers, maybe not. Then add little details when everything has dried, or nothing at all, if the painting is meant to stay light and really loose. I think this is suitable for coloring within shapes, or for painting simple and quick shapes. There usually won't be a background color when you take the wet on dry approach. In other cases, especially landscapes where there's usually a background, we'll use the wet and wet technique first to paint a quick base and block in the main colors and shapes fast while keeping the paint looking light thanks to all the water in the brush and paper. This is what you could call a base layer, and I use this technique in landscapes and portraits mostly because I like the background and colors to look smooth and blend well together. A realism artist will most likely add layers to their work no matter what technique they start with. In contrast, someone with a looser style will keep it minimalistic and hardly add any layers. Something I think all beginners should know is that in watercolor there's something called the ugly stage, and that happens in the early phases of a painting because usually colors are very light. Only the shapes were blocked in, but it's all very bland and boring, and you cannot really see the painting come together at this point. So it can be very discouraging. And you'll be amazed that most times when you keep going, things come together all of a sudden towards the end of the painting. That's the beauty of watercolors. When we're satisfied with how a painting looks in terms of shapes, colors, and contrast, that's when we can go ahead and use the wet on dry technique again, but this time just to add details. And these are going to pop because the paper is dry, so they stay sharp. And also because we can make them look darker and more opaque by adding less water to our paint. Now that you have a good idea of how watercolors work, there's something that beginners often miss when it comes to what to focus on to improve quicker. I've learned that the most important skill to get comfortable fast is to master water control. And I told you that I will be linking some helpful videos to help you with that in the description. But let me give you a little sneak peek of what this looks like. Things like color mixing, sketching, all the watercolor techniques, advanced tricks, all that is secondary, I think, because they can be added on as you practice. Well, water control comes naturally with each painting you're going to start, and focusing on mastering that first is the key to fast progress. So what is water control? To me, it's knowing how much or how little water to add to your paints, or your paintbrush, or your paper, and when to actually do it. I know that put that way, it sounds like a lot, but you'll see in the painting that we're going to practice next that you can learn that. Aside from practicing, my best tip for you will be to start with painting things like skies and galaxies, or just simple backgrounds on small sheets of paper. This is because these types of paintings require a lot of water to look soft and smooth, and you can also work with just one color at first, and add other colors later. And even later add cool effects to spice things up, like adding cloud effects in the sky or stars to a galaxy. It's a fun exercise, and in my experience, it's the fastest, easiest one to get comfortable with watercolors without getting discouraged. We're ready to start painting, but first remember this about watercolor. Never give up, especially in the beginning, because once you start mastering how to work with water and paint together, then it's gonna get just easier and so much fun. We are painting a sky with two colors with the wet and wet technique, drying it, and then adding the mountains and the birds with the wet on dry technique. That's it, and it makes for a gorgeous painting. And you'll see it's going to be smooth and super fun. Get a piece of 5 by 7 inches watercolor paper. Mine is 100% cotton cold pressed 300 grams per square meter paper for information. But if you have cellulose paper, it's just fine. Tape this sheet all around with some masking tape, like that. You have 2 jars of water nearby, paper towels, paintbrushes, and a set of paints with a mixing tray. We will only be using pink and blue. Any pink and blue you have, or even red and blue if you don't have pink. Mine is actually a red pinkish color. I'm going to use these natural hair paintbrushes, so 1 large to paint this initial wash in this painting. You can see will be good to cover the background quite fast. And then I have this smaller paintbrush to add elements to my painting. Notice it's slightly pointed, and that would be awesome to add fine details, but it's also big enough to paint shapes that will fit this paper size well, like the mountains. And also notice there is no sketch to draw, so the only other tool you might want to use is a hairdryer or a heat gun, and that's it. Let's mix paints first. Remember a watery consistency to start. So I wet my paintbrush in clear water, and I'm going to pick up a pink color from my set. I drop the paint, add water, and so on, until I get myself a nice spot of paint that I think will be enough for the sky. Remember to make sure it's not too light. We want the pink to show a little bit. I make sure to rinse my paintbrush well, and I do it again with blue. And if your pink or your blue is not exactly like mine, do not worry, because this kind of detail will not change the looks of your painting that much. Here I have 2 mixes of paint, and they are watery, but I did add enough pigment that they should still look vibrant when they dry. We're going to wet our sheet first with a clean paintbrush and clear water. I go for my larger paintbrush because it's going to help me cover up the sheet much faster than with my smaller one. I'm going back and forth to get into all the nooks and crannies of the paper. It's important. Another thing, especially with cotton paper, because it takes water so well, insist a bit by adding more water and pushing it inside the fibers with that back and forth. It takes me about 30 seconds to a minute on a size like this. It might take you less long if it's cellulose paper because cellulose paper doesn't take water as well. It's a good thing to proceed that way because when the paper is wet, not just outside, but also inside, you can take your time a bit more and colors tend to flow better and look smoother when they dry. I think that's good. Notice my paper is very wet and it's evenly wet. I don't have any puddles of water floating on top. If you do, make sure to soak them back up gently with a drier paintbrush, one that's not full of water. Now let's pick up the blue paint we mixed. I start applying it at the top and I keep going in a back and forth movement. Let's rinse this paintbrush quickly in the jar that is meant to end up all dirty with paint. And again, don't worry if you get them mixed up, you just change the water. Now rinse again, but this time in the clear water jar, so we don't turn our pink paint into a purple. Let's pick up pink and I'm proceeding in the same way as with blue, starting from the bottom this time. I'm going to overlap both colors here in the middle to complete a gradient that will look purple since pink and blue make purple. You can tap the paintbrush like this to create a better, more natural blending effect. We do have a beautiful background here. There shouldn't be puddles of paint sitting on top of the sheet still, unless you're using maybe a type of paper that takes water less well and warps easily. That's a possibility. In that case, I try and even the paint out a little bit without meddling too much or for too long, and I do it with a clean and damp paintbrush. Remember, we want to avoid adding even more water from the paintbrush at this point. I'm going to try this with my heat gun. And you can see I go in circles all over the painting, not just one part, so all of it dries at the same pace. Make sure this is completely dry. It should not feel damp at all, and it actually takes me a while to dry it, not just a few seconds, a lot more than that. It's possible your background at this point doesn't look as smooth as mine, and keep in mind that this is not my first time, first of all, and I'm using one of the top watercolor papers, Arche, and it helps a lot. I'm happy with my background. If you find yours a bit light, an option is to go for a second layer, and in this case, you would add a little bit of pigment to your paint mixes to make colors look more vibrant, and you would repeat all we just did. Just make sure that the sheet is absolutely completely dry first. Then you would wet the sheet again, only this time in a second layer. It would be quicker. Then you would add each color like we did and finally dry this again. Now I'm going to grab my smaller paintbrush and I'm going to add a bit of pigment in my paints to make them creamier. So this addition looks a bit more vibrant and a bit more opaque on top of the transparent background. I'm going to paint a mountain with a blue paint. You can press a bit with the side of the brush to make large strokes, and even use the tip to refine the top line of the mountain. Since it's still wet, I know I can add pink if I want to, and both colors should be able to merge together when wet. I would not add touches of pink like these if the mountain was dry or almost dry because I want pink and blue to mix up. Look at how pretty this is. I'm happy, so I'm gonna try that. Now, right from my mixing tray, I'm going to create purple by mixing both colors, and I can even add both pink and blue pigments to make it thick. Remember, we're painting from light to dark, and consistencies go from watery to creamy to thick. Now, with the tip of the paintbrush, I'm going to add a few cute birds. These are shapes that you can try, and see how I press sometimes with my brush to create large parts. But most times I'm using the tip because those birds are small. You can try and vary their size, their shape, and their location so it looks natural, not too perfect. And see how these pop on the page because they're dark and opaque on top of a light, transparent sky. We're going to pull the tape, and we're going to do that gently because depending on what you're using, some of them might tear up your sheet a little, some won't, so you want to be careful. And voila! Congratulations on making your very first beautiful landscape. If you made it till here, congratulations! You'll notice in the description that as a bonus, you can download a summary of this video with all key concepts and references. And you will also find links to all supplies, links to helpful playlists, and even links to beginner classes that I teach on Skillshare. With all of that, you are set to keep practicing and improving. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.